First of all, just on the United States and China competing in Africa, I actually think the real competition will come in the Middle East.
Hmm.
Because, as you know better than I do, Jeff, the Chinese economy depends very heavily on imported oil from the Gulf. And the Persian Gulf has long been an area of great strategic interest to the United States. But if you think about it, competition between the United States and China in the Gulf bleeds into competition in that sphere of security that you want to create in East Asia. Because if I'm the United States and I'm competing with the Chinese in the Middle East, I know they have a blue water navy that is coming out of East Asia, going through, say, Southeast Asia through the Straits of Malacca and heading, towards the Persian Gulf. So what's going on in East Asia, especially Southeast Asia, has an impact on what's going on vis-a-vis the Chinese in the Middle East. So you can see where a competition in the Middle East, which, as you correctly pointed out, is not naturally a sphere for either one of those great powers, can have an impact on how the United States thinks about interfering or not interfering in East Asia, especially in Southeast Asia. This is the point that I was making before. Just another quick point. Uh, you talk about there have been long periods of peace. I would not use the word peace, although I fully understand what you're saying, Jeff. My argument is that when you're dealing with great powers, you have constant security competition. Sometimes that security competition is more or less intense. There's no question about that. You're not at each other's throat every day. But the name of the game is to make sure that the security competition remains a security competition and doesn't turn into a hot war. I think
Yep.
all three of us are in total agreement on that point. And again, we live in a nuclear world, and the last thing we want is a real war. And the basic argument is that it's important to understand, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I'll say it, but to accept my logic because it's so powerful and you want to work around it. In other words, what I'm saying is you can't take my logic, my tragedy of great power politics logic off the table. It's just baked into the system. And you want to recognize that and you want to work around it. So that's the argument that I'm making. I'm not making the argument that we want to go out and strangle the Chinese tomorrow and we just got to do more to hammer the Russians. That's not my argument. My argument is understand how this world works, understand the tragic nature of international politics, and do everything you can to manage it.
But
Now,
John, if I may, I don't want to interrupt, but
no, go ahead.
in a way, that's what I'm trying to do, which is to say, okay, at least keep a distance because you're so prone to stumble into conflict. At least know, have the sense, don't go to Ukraine and Georgia with NATO for God's sake. Why don't Americans understand that? And we agree on that point, but I say it as a point of principle. Stay out of their neighborhood for heaven's sake. Exactly for your reason, which is it's so easy to stumble into crisis.
Well, my
And we're in
response,
it, actually.
to put it mildly, my
Yes.
response is not directed at you, but it's directed at those people who thought we could and can expand NATO to include Georgia
Oh,
and
okay.
Ukraine.
Yes.
They do not accept my logic.
I
They,
do.
I know, okay, but I'm just saying they don't. And if
Okay.
they, my argument all along has been if you understood basic balance of power logic, you would not try to extend NATO into Ukraine and into Georgia. Because in my rhetoric, that is clearly a well established sphere of influence for the Russians, and they will fight to the death to prevent you from turning Ukraine into a launching pad for missiles
Right.
that can hit Russia.
So
That's
we're in complete agreement on that. But the only point I'm trying to make to add a nuance is if we call it a sphere of security in Ukraine, not a sphere of influence, we free ourselves, I think, from a legitimate argument, but what about the Ukrainians? And my view is they have the right to trade with who they want, but they don't have the right to host whoever they want militarily. That's my point. Uh, and that's the difference.
Okay. Well, as I said, I think that getting mutual agreement
Yeah.
and making it stick is very difficult. I want to make another point, and I'm going to go to great lengths not to get into the weeds here, but prisoner's dilemma is fundamentally different than the logic that I lay out. And the reason is that prisoner's dilemma does not involve relative gains. In other words, it is not concerned about what I gain as a prisoner versus what you gain as a prisoner, Jeff. I only care about what Jeff does in the prisoner's dilemma in terms of whether it maximizes my utility. I get the best possible deal for myself. So I care about what Jeff does, so I get a good deal. What happens to Jeff in the end, I don't care about, right? Whether Jeff ends up more powerful than me or not, it doesn't matter in prisoner's dilemma. All I care about is my own utility, to put it in social science speak. My logic is fundamentally different. My logic is that I care greatly what happens to Jeff, how much power Jeff gains as a result of playing out the prisoner's dilemma versus how much John gets. Relative power matters greatly, or to put it in slightly different terms, relative gains underpins my realist logic, whereas absolute gains, right? You only care about your own gains in prisoner's dilemma. So I think that prisoner's dilemma is not analogous to what I'm talking about. Now, let me make two other very quick points. One is just on Germany. I actually think that we got the best solution. We basically cut it in half, and we had the Cold War. Your argument is no, that we should have had a neutral Germany. We should have let Germany reunify after the war, and it becomes neutral. It's largely disarmed, sort of like what we did after World War One.
Mhm. But
The,
without the punitive side.
okay, without the punitive side. But the problem is you cannot be certain what Germany will look like in 20 or 30 years. You cannot guarantee me that that unified Germany, even if it is neutral in 1945 or 46, whenever, will be neutral in 1996. And I don't want to take a chance. So I think we came up with the best solution. We just cut it into pieces. And by the way, this raises the question of what you would have done with Germany in 1918. Knowing what we now know, what would you do with Germany in 1918? It was an incredibly powerful state in 1918, right? In terms of latent power, wow. And what do? Do you treat it in a benevolent way, as Keynes advocated, and as you surely believe? Do you bring it back into the so-called community of nations? You've just fought a world war against this country. Uh, if you could have divided it in half in 1918 and kept it divided, you would have avoided World War II. So you want to understand that this inability of ours to figure out what the future looks like gives states very powerful incentives to behave in ruthless ways at the moment so that they stave off disaster down the road. My final point, I want to agree with you, and this is the whole business of geographical proximity and the idea of putting missiles in a place like Ukraine, and even putting ABM systems in Eastern Europe. Those ABM systems, by the way, could have easily been used to launch offensive missiles
Yes.
against Russia, right? Look, in the Cold War in the 1980s, the Reagan administration was in power, and we now know, we knew it at the time, at least most of us did, that we were itching to develop a first strike capability against the Soviet Union. And given that they had a massive number of missiles, the way you did it was with a decapitation strategy. And I remember people used to say, well, we won't get all of the Soviet missiles, some will be left. And there will be, this was the phrase that was used at the time, a ragged retaliation. And the reason that we needed Star Wars was to deal with the ragged
Mm,
retaliation.
mhm.
But remember, we were talking about putting Pershings and ground launched cruise missiles, medium range missiles. This is what the Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile Treaty or Missile Treaty, the INF, was designed to eliminate. The Soviets were glad to have an INF treaty because they viewed those Pershings and Glickums in Western Europe as part of a decapitation strategy.
Mhm.
So you're absolutely right that the idea that we could take Ukraine and use it as a launching pad against Russia was a prescription for disaster. And I think any good realist, and this includes the three of us, understands that that was asking for big trouble. And needless to say, we got big trouble. And then, of course, what do? We doubled down. We let Ukraine launch attacks
Yes, exactly.
against Russia's strategic nuclear weapons. Just think about that. Not only that, to take it a step further, we allowed Ukraine to invade Mother Russia, right? So you can fully understand why, from a Russian point of view, this is categorically unacceptable for Ukraine or for Georgia to be in NATO, as you pointed out. And I think from your point of view, and from my point of view, and certainly from Glenn's point of view, this was a remarkably foolish move.